The South African Health Products Regulatory Authority has scrapped authorization of ivermectin for COVID-19 patients. The body had allowed its use in January last year amid public interest and reports of illicit ivermectin entering the market. It said that since the program was introduced, more evidence has emerged around the efficacy of the drug. We're joined now by the Deputy Director at the African Health Research Institute, Professor Thumbi Ndung'u. Good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight, sir. When we look at, the decision by the Health Products Authority to scrap the use of ivermectin, and it really forces us to go back last year and evaluate the circumstances under which this approval was granted. Do you think that they were acting largely out of public pressure?
Good evening, Kathy, and good evening to the viewers. Yeah, I think that there was a lot of controversy, obviously, in the beginning about the efficacy of ivermectin for prevention and treatment of COVID-19. And I think that at the time, there were very few or very limited options, particularly for prevention, as well as for treatment, of course. And I think that at that time, because of the controversy and with some studies suggesting that there might be some efficacy of this drug against COVID-19, you could understand the decision that was taken by the health authorities to authorize it under controlled circumstances. But of course, things have changed dramatically, and we have a lot of evidence now, and all the evidence points to the fact that this drug does not work against COVID-19. So there is no need really for people to continue to use this drug for treatment of COVID-19.
Of course, there are those who still swear by the use of the drug. Let's talk about the research that has refuted any efficacy when it comes to the treatment of COVID-19.
Yeah, I think one has to understand the way biomedical research is conducted. First of all, people do studies in the laboratory. And when people do studies in the laboratory, in a laboratory setting, it doesn't mean that what they find in the laboratory will always translate into the reality when that particular drug or when that particular intervention is introduced in the human population. And I think this is what has happened with the ivermectin, where there was a bit of controversy, particularly because there were some studies done particularly in vitro settings or in laboratory settings in a test tube that showed that the ivermectin could work against viral infections, in particular against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And some of these studies did suggest that there was some efficacy of the drug against the virus. However, the doses that were being used in these laboratory studies were very, very high. And when these kind of doses are replicated in humans, they are associated with a lot of harmful side effects. And so the only way really to resolve the controversy when something like that arises for any drug is to do what we call randomized clinical trials. So randomized clinical trials are the gold standard, because what you do is that you give the drug that is in question, such as ivermectin, and you give a placebo to people that don't know what drug they are receiving. And in some cases, even the doctors themselves, they don't know whether they are giving the drug itself or the placebo. And this is the gold standard for testing all medications in the medical field. And this is what has been done now and replicated several times with ivermectin through randomized clinical trials. And all the randomized clinical trials, including the very latest one from Brazil that included more than 3,500 people, showed that ivermectin had no effect whatsoever in preventing people from getting severe COVID-19 or progressing to hospitalization or to death. And so I think there is no further debate about this drug. It doesn't work against COVID-19, and there is no need for people to continue to use it for treatment of this disease.
If memory serves correct, at the time that, again, there was pressure for ivermectin to be allowed as a treatment for COVID-19, you had a lot of doctors at the time that took the stand and said that they were going to prescribe the drug even if it wasn't the recommendation of the Health Products Authority. What happens now, and how important is that consensus within the medical field?
I think it is important to point out, Kathy, that at the time that a lot of the doctors were saying that they would like to be allowed to use a drug and they would continue to use it for their patients, as I mentioned, there was a lot of controversy and there was hardly any evidence. And so in cases where there is this kind of controversy and there is a rationale for how the drug might work, the health authorities would consider the use of that particular drug under emergency situations until the evidence comes through. So this is allowed that if the drug is not harmful and there is some rationale and reason to believe that it might work against a particular disease, then it can be allowed under those emergency conditions. And I think that this is what our Health Products Authority did, was to approve this temporarily for emergency use in certain circumstances. But as I mentioned, what then scientists have been doing since is to conduct randomized clinical trials, which are the gold standard for testing any medication. So I think that even for those doctors and healthcare professionals who are recommending the use of this drug, I think now there is no more further controversy around this, given the fact that randomized clinical trials, and these are double-blind, have shown that this drug does not work. So there would be no reason now at this stage for anybody to prescribe this for the treatment of COVID-19.
What does this mean, again, for the patients? Because sometimes, you know, you have a lot of hesitancy, even including around research that is being conducted, and people still insisting on finding access, you know, to some of these drugs, regardless of whether or not it's legal. And so what is your message to patients today?
My message to patients and to the general community would be that that there may have been some justification under some circumstances to use this particular medication because of the controversy that was there, with some studies suggesting that it might work under certain circumstances. But the evidence now is in. Studies have been conducted, and these are very well conducted randomized clinical studies that involve large numbers of people. And so there is absolutely no need now to use this particular drug. It has no effect whatsoever. And people should be aware that this drug also has some severe side effects if it is misused, if it is self-prescribed. And so so there is no need now to under any circumstances, to use ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. So that would be my message to people. Let's get let's get this controversy behind us, rather, and move on, because the evidence is in. And I think we should be depending on scientific evidence. And so that would be my message to people, that we have to trust medical science, particularly when it is executed very well, as has been done in this case with the randomized clinical trials.
All right.